What's up, fellow drivers? Today we're going to talk tuner magazines. I just picked one up, but we'll get back to it at the end of this video because I have a feeling it might be a little lame. So first, I want to talk about what they used to be like. Back in the early 90s and even the early 2000s, the internet had a completely different landscape than it does today. Social media like Instagram and Snapchat didn't even exist, and it took a while for websites and apps to become the default outlet for any type of media. Magazines were where it was at. The import culture of modifying Japanese cars steadily grew in the 90s, and some of the most popular magazines were publications like Sport Compact Car and Option from Japan. But I didn't get into it until later. Most of the magazines we'll be looking at, like Super Street, just got their start in the late 90s. After Fast and the Furious exploded onto the scene, the popularity of modifying Japanese sports cars grew faster than a pubescent teenage boy. Suddenly it felt like even if they weren't old enough to drive, everyone was playing Need for Speed or watching Initial D and reading every tuner mag they could get their hands on. When I was in high school, I would jump at the chance just to go to the grocery store with my mom, so while she was picking out produce, I could spend the whole time looking through car magazines. By that time, there were a ton to choose from, like Super Street, Import Tuner, Modified Magazine, and DSport. I remember the first one I ever bought back in 2005. It was Import Tuner. It had a red S13 and a leggy blonde on the cover. It also had a small article on the benefits of doing maintenance on an MR2. Apparently they got an extra 3.5 horsepower just from doing things like an oil change and spark plug change. If you look at it a little bit closer, you'll see loads of advertisements for wheels, tires, body kits, and other car parts. I remember this article in particular that talks about Nismo's 20th anniversary GTR that cost $165,000. You'll also find models in most of the larger articles, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. I feel really lucky that all of my magazines were not thrown out. This isn't even close to how many I bought over the years, but I kept the best ones. Looking back through them is not only nostalgic, but there's some good info and featured cars that I don't know where else I would find. Modified mags soon became my favorite of the magazines. They were some of the thickest available with over 200 pages. They also seemed to feature MR2s more often than others for some reason. Modified also had a lot of easy to understand technical articles and product reviews that helped me learn what was what, because as a kid up until that point, I really wasn't interested in cars at all. Another benefit of Modified was that there weren't too many half-naked women on the cover to raise the eyebrows of my parents. Pretty soon I got a subscription. This February 2006 issue not only showed what magazines were like back in the day, but what car culture in general was like. This article is about learning to drift and calls it a new sport. By now, Formula D may seem like a mainstay or even declining in popularity, but in 2006, it was new and exciting. In the US, drifting had yet to hit its full stride. There was also a full feature on a white MR2 that I remember clear as day even before I flipped through this magazine again. It features a pretty loud body kit, but it was in back then. It was estimated to make 400 wheel horsepower. This was unimaginable for me at the time, and quite impressive in 2006. My MR2 had a 5S FE and made 135 horsepower, and I had no money. But this was the kind of thing I dreamed of. This issue of Modified features an even more incredible MR2. This was from Japan, and rumor has it eventually got parted out. If you know anything about it, hit me up. It was full of amazing one-off custom modifications. The entire front end was converted to a clamshell similar to what you'd see on a Viper or some Ferraris. The interior was completely custom suede leather. The owner said the build took 18 months and cost $22,000 on top of the car. Honestly, it looks like even more, but he did most of the work himself. This car is the perfect example of the originality of builds during that time. For a while, there were articles from Tarzan Yamada, a lightning-fast time attack driver who was famous for his bleached hair and iconic monkey and going by Tarzan. In this article from 2007, he talks about his plans for going to Hot Import Nights. Believe it or not, it was probably the top show at the time, and it was also the first real import show I went to with my friends. Let's just say things got a little crazier back then and weren't as family friendly. In the same issue, they also went behind the scenes of Best Motoring. Surprisingly, I would not actually watch any of the videos until years later. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look them up as soon as you're done with this video. Thank me later. Modified did feature models like Lisa Kim Fleming, but they were classy and subtle part of the magazine. Looking at this issue of Super Street, you can tell with this impartial survey, they were already feeling a bit like there isn't enough room to go around for all the Tuner magazines available at that point. This won't be the last time Super Street staff takes a friendly shot at their rivals. Prime Media was the publisher of Super Street, and they had recently been acquiring many of the other automotive magazines such as Modified Mag. In this issue, they also acknowledged the passing of the founder, Robert Peterson. Yes, that's the same guy whose name is on the museum in LA. He started Hot Rod magazine back in 1948 and eventually branched into most of the automotive magazines you know today. You can also see the Wong Way column by Jonathan Wong, a name you'll be hearing a lot of. He's known as JDM Wong, and if you're not following him on Instagram, you probably should be. His shadow casts far and wide. He got the name from being one of the people that really popularized the whole Japanese domestic market craze. And you can definitely see why here. He's discussing JDM shoes. If you think you're JDM, ask yourself if your shoes are JDM, and think again. Super Street, like many of the other magazines, covered all the big events, and it just made me want to go to more. The Super Street staff just looks like they're having fun. Taking a look at this issue as a whole, you can see Super Street is pretty thick at this point too, with almost 200 pages. That doesn't stop them from taking another swing at Modified though. Speaking of the proliferation of tuner mags, take a look at Modified Luxury and Exotics. This one was a bit short-lived, but I was pretty excited about it at the time. An exotic is pretty much every car guy's dream, and back in 2008, modifying them was still pretty unheard of in the US. Japan had been doing it since, well, always. But it was just starting to become a thing over here. Nowadays, Liberty Walk Ferraris and other crazy projects may be seen as badass, but it would take several more years before that would be accepted. This issue has an article on the now nearly forgotten SSC Ultimate Aero TT. Brief as it was, this car beat the Bugatti Veyron and took the title of fastest road legal production car with 257 miles per hour. But back to the modified exotics. This tuned Ferrari 360 is a great example. And can we take a moment to recognize how commonly accepted the term ICE was? Yeah, that's a sign of the times. Okay, back to Super Street. It's 2009 now, and the cover car for September is fire. Also, nobody would have known what the fuck you were talking about if you said that back then. Super Street was a little thinner than it used to be at just under 100 pages. But it had really come into its own and found its voice. They'd feature a letter of the month each issue. I always thought it would be cool to be featured that way, but never actually wrote in, so that never went anywhere. By this time, Jonathan Wong is the editor-in-chief. In fact, he actually took on the role shortly after the last issue of Super Street I talked about in late 2007. One of his direct influences is a column I always enjoyed, Tetsu's Tales. He was a contributor from Japan and supposedly got the gig by randomly contacting Jonathan about exchanging random Japanese products for American stuff. Somehow this led to his English showing up in print every month. Super Street definitely wasn't afraid to make jokes or shy away from innuendos. Another one of its regular articles was the Quickie. They literally used the tagline, "Get you off in 2 pages." And this ad was a mainstay for years. Super Street was just fun, if not a little pervy. Now take a look at the cover car. This RE Amemiya RX-7 is one of my all-time favorite builds. Some may say it looks dated now, but in today's landscape of endless rivet-on Liberty Walk copies, I'd love to see some stuff like this again. And don't get me wrong, I'm actually a huge Liberty Walk fan, but I just feel like too many people jumped on the trend bandwagon and it's a little played out. This car has plenty of go to match the show with almost 480 horsepower. Also, take a look at the out-of-this-world wheel covers in this shot. Only in Japan, people. Another thing I always looked forward to in any of the magazines was the show coverage, like this article on Spocom. Note Jonathan Wong's EF. If you're into it, you can actually see it on display at the Peterson Museum right now. Moving into 2010, we're going to see a lot of import tuner. But first, let's look at this January issue of Super Street. In this editor's letter, Jonathan takes a look back on the past decade and how it has changed since the huge boom of the Fast and the Furious. Drag racing had hit its peak and was less popular by 2010. Drifting, which was now hugely popular, had barely been heard of before. And we were finally getting used to the dreaded OBD2. He also makes a plea for us to buy the damn mag. The internet is pretty much the standard for news now, and business use of social media is picking up in a big way. That being said, magazines are still going fairly strong at this point. He makes the case that as convenient and useful as the internet is, it can't replace actually having something in your hand, and I totally agree. To quote Mr. Wong, you can flip through it for years beyond, tear out a page to tape to your wall, or masturbate to. End quote. I'm sure none of you ever did that, right? Anyway, look at this. Toyota was teasing us with a concept for the FRS. Do you think it turned out looking better or worse? And in true form, they continued to yank us around with super concepts for another decade to the point where I really don't even care about it now, and that it's finally going to be real. But that's a topic for another video. I eagerly read the tech support section, where people wrote in with questions. I always wished there would be info on MR2s, but it never really happened. Import models had been featured in Super Street for a while now, but previously had been surprisingly limited to a page here or there and didn't have full features. I dreamed of one day being featured in the Reader's Ride section, but my car was basically stock, and I still had no money. Sadly, that dream never came true, because by the time my car may have actually been worth submitting, Reader's Rides wasn't really a thing. Funny though, looking back at it, the standard wasn't really that high, so I probably should have just sent it in anyway. At this point in time, I would say Import Tuner was the IT magazine. See what I did there? It, because IT, Import Tuner. But seriously, it embodies the import world and lifestyle better than any other magazine at the time. It had already revved up to the top of the industry way back in the late 90s, shortly after its initial launch in 98. But its success continued to grow even more. You can see they even covered things like video games and other tech. It was always a small section, but they definitely knew their audience and tried to get in a little of everything young males were into. At this point, Honda was not the giant in the community that it used to be, but they were still very popular, and this interesting article on weight reduction featured an Army Green Integra. And here's another Honda by way of the NSX, which is featured with a Skyline GTR. It always felt like Import Tuner was getting first dibs on the best cars and models. I mean, look at Maureen Chen. She is definitely one of the hottest models to ever grace the pages of any tuner magazine. You may have noticed that from the cover, the Import Tuner features its models very prominently and gave them full interviews that span several pages. This is when they really started to be more than just random eye candy to spice up a review of flywheels. They gave them a voice. Fans could actually get to know them a little. Like I said, Import Tuner did have some good technical articles, but covered the import industry in general more than other magazines. The whole magazine seemed a little more polished than the rest too. The quality of the photography was top-notch, and the content, cars or otherwise, matched up just as well. But let's take a look at another girl featured in this October issue. This girl is the owner of this RSX. So what, you might say? Well, think about this. Did you see the owner prominently featured with their car in any other article I've shown you? Did most of them even show their face at all? No. There's a reason for that. The staff was targeting a male audience, and the readers don't care about looking at another dude. They just wanted to see cool cars and hot girls. I don't say I was any different either. The point that I'm making is that all of these magazines were focused on a male readership. Even when a female-owned car was featured, it was definitely from a male's perspective, and they had to cash in on the novelty of an attractive girl owner. Now you might say, so what? Guys are most of the people into cars, and there's nothing wrong with a magazine for guys. And you would totally be right. All I'm saying is, have you ever wished there were more girls at car meets, or wondered why none of your girlfriends have ever been into cars? This is part of the reason why. We created a culture around cars that was only for guys. But let's move on to this May 2011 issue. Charles moves over from Superscreet to Import Tuner. This is a good example of how small of a world it was and still is. It was not uncommon for staff members to work for one magazine then another, then even start their own thing together after leaving. Keeping up the high standard of cars, we now have a beautiful blue Skyline from Japan. If I haven't mentioned this already, the Skyline GTR V-Spec 2 NUR was my ultimate dream car for a long time. And keeping up with the high standard of models, we have one of the biggest names in the import model history, Amy Faye. She was on top for pretty much her whole modeling career, and it's not hard to see why. She was still active until recently, doing modeling outside of the car scene too. Given everything I said about the last issue, you might think that I was down on models, and I am being a hypocrite now. That's not really true though. I think that if a girl wants to be a model, more power to her. I also don't see anything wrong with models in car magazines. My point is that girls should do and be recognized for what they want to do, not what some guys want. More on this later. Import Tuner hits it out of the park again in August 2012. In my eyes, the ultimate body kit for the GTR is from Ben Sopra. This car blew my mind and still does. There were very few kits made, and this one was the first and debuted at the famous Tokyo Auto Salon. It comes from Japan and went for $50,000. That's the kit alone. This also happens to be tuned to 1,000 horsepower. Generally, I'm more into clean, subtle looks and don't plan to do anything too crazy to the body of my GTR, but this is definitely an exception. If I suddenly became wildly irresponsible, Ben Sopra is where I would put my money. Look at this incredible one-piece front end. It's not unlike the one from the MR2 earlier in the video. I guess I have a thing for that look. Oh, and here's a sign of larger changes influencing the car world. In a rare twist, California smog laws actually became a little less punishing. Any car model year 2000 or newer would no longer require a tailpipe sniff. This meant that as long as the diagnostic plugged into your OBD2 port didn't notice anything funny, you passed. On the other hand, there was also the dreaded visual inspection. If you had any obvious modifications that didn't have carb stickers, you were toast. This is pretty much the same procedure we have to this day, and if you do anything too crazy to your car, you're going to need to know some people. In the back, we have the usual model feature, this time with Ashley V. She is surprisingly one of the older models featured, but despite this, is one of the most active today. She's changed up her look quite a bit since then, but has a huge following. So this is where I'm going to leave it for now. Be sure to watch part 2 to hear about the disappearance of Jonathan Wong, the death of the magazines, and what's going on today. Thanks for watching. This is the end of side A. Please flip the tape over to hear side B.